I'm Richard Dodd, and you're listening to the Ecology Academy podcast. This is a show where we get to talk and learn about all things ecological, including interviews with top ecologists, both employers and employees, those working with ecologists, and also aspiring and inspiring career-seeking individuals setting out to make a difference. The show aims to provide you with insights, advice, and inspiration to help you succeed and excel as an effective ecologist and to make a real difference to our natural environment. Today I'm speaking with Stuart Newson, who is a senior research ecologist in the population modelling and ecology research team with the British Trust for Ornithology. He's responsible for survey design and analysis of data from large national surveys of wild bird and mammal populations. Projects include a number of collaborations involving the large-scale analysis of bat and bird survey data with UK and overseas university academics and NGO researchers. He's also been awarded the Marsh Award for Innovative Ornithology, a member of Natural England's Bat Expert Panel, and member of UK Avian Population Estimates Panel, a research fellowship on bioacoustics, PhD and MSc supervisor, and Norwich Bat Group Committee member. Now, whilst the core of his work has been on birds, he has a personal interest in bats and acoustic monitoring, and in particular, how technology can deliver new opportunities for conservation and provide new ways to engage with larger audiences. Stuart is the lead scientist for the BTO Acoustic Pipeline, which brings cutting-edge sound identification of bats and other nocturnal wildlife to your desktop. So, Stuart, welcome to the Ecology Academy podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And really good to meet you as well.
Yeah, and yourself. I mean, I think I do remember you from some of the the Bat Conservation Trust conferences. This is going back quite a few years now, but
Yeah, same here. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, Stuart, we start these conversations off with a few innocent questions. So they are just a quick fire round, no right or wrong answer at all. So it's just to delve into sort of the hearts and minds of the individual ecologists. So, and just a little icebreaker, really. So, with very little preparation, you ready to begin?
Yeah, go ahead.
Excellent. So you can answer as long or as short as you like on these questions at all. So if you want to skip one, you can't. No, you can.
Okay.
You're getting it up to you. So, first of all, favourite band of all time? We can say artist as well if you prefer.
Afraid it's got to be. That's so difficult. I think maybe ABBA.
ABBA.
They're just timeless. They're just so timeless.
Excellent. Have you got vivid memories of dancing around to ABBA at university, as we? Yeah.
A few years back. Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you had a superpower, it could be any superpower at all. What would it be? And probably more importantly, how would you use it?
Okay, superpower. I think seeing in the dark. Now I'm into bats. It'd be really good to see in the dark.
That's a good one.
That would be really good.
Excellent. Now this could be a seemingly innocent question, but dogs or cats?
Dogs, definitely.
Excellent. There's no hesitation there at all. Okay.
No.
Okay. And if you had to choose, would you spend your guilt-free time either reading a book, watching a film, or dancing to ABBA?
Not dancing to ABBA, because I'm not very good at dancing, I don't think. I think probably reading a book.
Okay, good one.
Yeah.
Are you reading one at the moment?
Actually, I tend to pick up non-fiction.
Oh, yeah.
A bit kind of dry. I don't think my family quite understand it. But I'm just reading Neil Middleton's new book on social calls.
Excellent. So
books, I think.
Work is life and life is work at the moment, is it? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree with that. In terms of my reading preferences, I think that most of my books tend to be, as you say, non-fiction. Really, to much of the dismay of my daughter, who constantly wants me to get into Percy Jackson, which I think
my kids love Percy Jackson.
Yeah, they're great.
Yeah.
They are great books.
Yeah, good films as well, actually.
Good films too. Yeah. And finally, bats or birds?
I knew you'd ask that one. So most of my career has been birds.
Yeah.
So yeah, over 25, 30 years, I've been working on birds. I think I'm going to break convention here. I'm going to choose both. And I think the reason is, I think I've learned so much from birds, particularly working with big data sets, how to organize surveys, how to analyze big data sets, that I've then taken to start thinking about bats. So I'm going to break convention. I'm going to choose both, I'm afraid.
They're absolutely fine. Yeah, we're like people who think outside the box. That's great. Great. Well, thank you so much for that, Stuart. That's given me a little, great insight, and hopefully other people as well, into sort of the mind of a research ecologist who loves ABBA.
Oh dear.
So we won't come back.
Remember me for that.
That's it. If we take anything away from this podcast, it's that ABBA is your favourite band. There we go. And I suppose moving on then. So let's look about your sort of life journey so far in terms of your career as an ecologist. So could you take me back, sort of paint me a picture, say, of how you got into ecology, why you did, it's a bit about your background growing up, and this is all before starting to work for the BTO. So tell me about where you were raised then, Stuart.
Okay, so I think, so probably my earliest memories are when I was about 5 or 6, and a family friend took us to a nature reserve, and there was I still remember it, just a kingfisher just perched out in front of a hide. And I think it was just that sparked my kind of inspiration to get into birds. And then every weekend, I'd get my poor parents to drive me to the middle of nowhere. Often my older brother, who wasn't into birds, had to look after me. So we got dropped in places like Colne Point, and we'd just spend the day wandering around the marshes. And I think probably fewer parents would do that nowadays, but that was an amazing time just to kind of learn about wildlife, and particularly birds. Birds were my kind of real focus at that point.
And this was in you grew up in Norfolk, was it?
It was in Essex, actually, in Clacton-on-Sea.
Yeah.
So we go to places like Aberton Reservoir and Holland Haven, which are really good for migrant birds. So that's how I kind of initially got into it. And then I guess I went through quite a traditional route. I did GCSEs. At that point, I was really into art. Yeah. That was my kind of big thing. And I applied for an art scholarship at it's quite an academic school. I got in on my kind of art ability, so I got a scholarship which kind of paid for the school fees, and it was just a real shock. I think up until that point, I did pretty well without any effort. I felt everything I did, I felt I got, and I went into this school and I was just getting average marks, and so I think that was a really, really important thing that showed that I had to work to get what I wanted. And I ended up doing art, chemistry and biology A-level. Yeah. And then again, it was a real dilemma. Do I choose biology or do I choose art to kind of go on for a degree? And at that point, I decided biology kind of won, and particularly zoology. I was most interested in, still really interested in birds, and but also mammals and kind of the bigger stuff, less so in plants. So I went on to do a degree in zoology at Bristol University. And
which year was this then? So what year were you looking at in terms of your?
I kind of wrote it down because my memory is really bad. I finished it in 1996.
So you started in 1993.
Yeah. And I think definitely the hardest thing I've ever done at A-levels. People look at me quite strangely when I say that, but I think partly it was working on things which are I was kind of less interested in, particularly chemistry. But for a degree, it was brilliant. There were really good lecturers, people like Gareth Jones, who I'm sure everyone knows, who works on bats, but a lot of really good lecturers.
So going back to then, so your choice of Bristol University then, so how
Yeah.
did you apply for other universities, and why did you choose Bristol if you did have a look at others?
I may have applied for more, but I remember Bristol was my first choice, and followed by UEA in Norwich. And I would have been quite happy to go to both, I think. But I quite liked the course at Bristol. There's a lot of, I don't know if it's so much of a traditional, it's quite a traditional university in terms of a lot of stuff about kind of dissections and things that I thought would be quite interesting. I think it's less dissections now, and but yeah, I kind of thoroughly enjoyed the degree, and
it's a zoology, wasn't it? A zoology degree.
Yeah, in zoology. But I got to the end and hadn't really thought what I was going to do next. So I've often tended to do that. So I started working for the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust, helping to put on satellite tags and radio tags on cormorants. And then I spent whole summer just chasing radio tag birds around the country, trying to find them and not having that much luck. So disperse and try to find them. But as part of that, I met Baz Hughes, who was at WWT at the time, and he managed to set me up doing initially a research master's on cormorants, and then quite quickly I turned that into a PhD, and that was amazing. I'd spend a lot of time just climbing, because I was comparing inland breeding cormorants and coastal breeding cormorants. I spent time going out to amazing offshore islands, places like South Wales and North Wales, and at the same time going to inland tree nesting colonies and climbing trees up to cormorant nests, colour ringing chicks. It was really good, and I learned a lot of really important lessons, some which probably less useful now. So one really important thing was,
I'm intrigued now.
When you're climbing up to a tree, keep your mouth closed, because the birds will just crap on you, and you'll have half digested fish come down onto you.
Lovely.
So quite quickly I learned to keep my mouth closed. Probably not a kind of lesson I kind of use today, but yeah, I definitely learned a lot doing that.
So in terms of, I mean, so your academic career, for instance, that you've sort of found your passion. Then, by the sounds of it, that you I was going to say disengaged in A levels, but you're more of an ends to a means to get you to university, and then a passion for learning, was it, or at university that drove you?
I think after doing A levels, every decision I've made has been choosing it because I thought I'd enjoy it most, and I think that's really helped me. I think every stage of my, I guess, progression through degree and masters and PhD and then to a job has been just choosing things you're really passionate about. If you're going to spend a lot of time doing something, you might as well try and find something you really enjoy.
And what particular was it about the thing you enjoyed the most? Was it actually the I'll leave it open to you, but was it the exploration, the sort of curiosity, or was it actually finding an answer that you enjoyed the most, or was it collaboration? I mean, what was it about the things you loved doing as part of that?
I think initially it was the field work got me into it. I do really enjoy being out in the field and collecting data that I can then analyse. So by doing that, I feel you really get an understanding of the data. If you're just analysing the data only, it's much harder to really understand it. So partly the field work, but also I do like analysing data and coming up with finding answers, things that surprise me about the data, whatever I'm looking at. Um, and I probably less enjoy writing it up at the end.
Yeah.
I think if I could just end there and just do that part of it, the field work, and find the answer and give it to someone else, that would be ideal. But sadly, I have to do that writing bit often.
Oh, I know what you mean. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's the end product. So I suppose I would say the fine detail, actually, but
yeah,
I suppose it's the analytical part seems to be the most important part to you. Then, so it's the sort of that journey, that unexpected find, I suppose, and problem solving.
yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, kind of making sense, and particularly working with big data sets.
Yeah.
So working at the BTO now, we have access to some really big data sets. So you can imagine it's kind of an ideal place to work.
Okay, so take us front. So that's it. So your PhD then, that was 1997 to 2000, I believe.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happened after
Yeah.
2000 then? So, Stuart.
So again, I think following my degree, I wasn't organised. I hadn't thought at all what I was going to do afterwards, but I booked a holiday. So that was the only thing I kind of thought about, to go to Spitsbergen
Okay.
with my brother. So amazing time. It was kind of reward, and also having booked it, I had to have written up my PhD by then. After I finished, I think I was a bit kind of single-minded. At that point, I only wanted a job working on seabirds, and a job on seabirds that would interest me.
Yeah.
So there wasn't anything immediate, no jobs advertised. So I started working for a computer company initially, trying to pay off all the kind of debts that I'd had from being a student. And I did that for maybe 7-8 months working in London. I definitely couldn't have continued to do that, but that was really helpful in allowing me to just spend a bit of time away, pay off the kind of a lot of the debt that I'd accumulated from being a student, and then everything after that.
Right.
And then I applied for a job at the BTO, and it was actually for the breeding bird survey organizer. And it wasn't particularly a job that I wanted to do, but I wanted to work for the BTO. And I applied for it, and I was told quite quickly, we're not going to offer you this job, but give us a couple of days. We like your application, and we're going to just have a think about this and get back to you. And I didn't actually expect to hear in a couple of days. Oops, lost the light.
Sorry.
Technical
issue there.
Technical issue. Yeah. So I applied for the job. I didn't get it, but I got promised that there might be something else available, and they created a job for me, analysing data. So analysing breeding bird survey data and survey data, and designing surveys.
Okay. If we just take a step back there, then. So, in terms of, you applied for that job. It wasn't the ideal job for you. But as I say, more the intention then was to join the organisation BTO. That was the sort of goal, rather than actually the role itself. Yeah. And I suppose, the interview, they probably thought, I don't know how you came across, but you're saying like, well, this may be not the right person for this role, but there's something in Stuart we see. Did they divulge, what that was, or, why did they create this role for you?
Not really. And to be honest, I didn't think I'd hear from them again. I thought they were just being nice at the interview.
Yeah.
But within a couple of days, they'd drawn out this new spec for a job, which was it was much more the type of stuff I wanted to do. Rather than organising a survey, it was actually away from working with people. I don't think that's necessarily my strength. But it was kind of analysing data, designing, inputting ideas for things. So perfect job for me.
Gosh, wonderful. And so in terms of then that role itself, I mean, how what sort of things did you get involved with? And I suppose leading on now towards how you set up the BTO acoustic pipeline.
Okay, it's a bit of an odd journey. So when I started the BTO, everything I did was on birds and mainly analysing big survey data like the breeding bird survey data. So related to survey design, but also analysing the mammal data, which is collected through the breeding bird survey data, and producing trends in things like rabbits and brown hares. And I think I've always had a kind of quite a general interest in other wildlife, particularly things that move. I know plants can move, but particularly, I guess, the zoology side of things. Yeah. And I think maybe just over 15 years ago, it's quite strange. I got approached to write a chapter on the mammals of the local common where I live. And I had an interest in mammals, but I didn't know anything at all about bats. But I thought, how difficult can this be?
Exactly, yes.
And I thought, the big stuff like deer, I can identify those. I'd done a lot of small mammal trapping in the past, so I was very experienced at small mammal trapping. So that was quite straightforward too.
Where did you get that experience from, Stuart?
So that was going back before my degree, but I continued doing it. So I helped people, the wetland centre at Barn Elms, the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust Centre.
Yeah.
I did a lot of small mammal trapping there, just helping people before they developed the reservoirs into the nature reserve. But I just continued, and at the time my partner worked for the Mammal Society, so I couldn't really escape doing kind of mammal things.
Yes.
And I think the other thing, I was, even though I did my PhD on cormorants, I was based in Bristol, the mammal group at Bristol University, in Steve Harris's group.
Oh, yes.
So I was the only person working on birds in a mammal group. So I'd go out helping to catch foxes and badgers and a whole load of other stuff, and helping, did a bit of work helping yellowneck mice, Aidan Marsh doing stuff on yellowneck mice around the Bristol area. So I kind of had a little bit of interest there.
So going back to, sorry, I did sidetrack you there. So returning to that sort of transition, say from birds to sort of, and including bats into your roles in BTO.
Yeah, and I had to write this local publication, and at that point I contacted the local bat group, Norwich bat group, and there's a guy there, Sam Phillips, who he worked at the time for a consultancy, I think ecology consultancy. And he was absolutely brilliant. Every weekend when they weren't using their detectors, so they had a load of anabats for their company, I'd drive in every kind of Friday evening, pick up their whole stash of bat detectors for the company. It was quite a big risk for them, I guess. And I would put them out on this local common to record bats. And then I'd make sure they were back just as they opened on Monday, before they tended not to use them over the weekends at that time. And I did that for months on end. So it's quite a round trip for me to drive into Norwich, pick up these detectors. But that really got me into the sound analysis side of things. And then I think I applied for a British Ecological Society grant, which allowed me to buy a full spectrum bat detector. And I started putting that out, and then getting into just kind of species identification, but mainly teaching myself. There's no one at the BTO who was really into bats, and no one apart from the bat group who are kind of really doing that much. And then it kind of developed from there. I made some links with UEA and we got a couple of master students, and we decided to set up a project, but it came out of a discussion with Sam again about the difficulties of leaving bat detectors out in really built up areas and the risk to kind of losing them. And so I tried to come up with an idea where we could try and survey initially Norwich. And my first idea was a bit slightly mad. It was to get an old banger car and just hide a bat detector on top of it and just move it around, get the students to move it around and leave it out.
So this is just a random car that you'd get and just play. So it's not moving at all.
A random car. Yeah. So that was the first idea. The second idea, which is a bit more sensible, was to we got a little bit of funding for some bat detectors, and the master students would then put out a press release information saying to encourage people to get in touch with them, to then put the bat detectors in their garden, leave them out over a few nights. And by doing that, we got quite an amazing, got it in the local newspapers and things. We got an amazing response from kind of locally. And we ended up carrying out a survey in every 1 kilometre square across Norwich. And I think what that really showed to me was there's huge interest from members of the public, people who perhaps haven't thought about bats at all. And if you make something that's really simple, where they could just borrow a bat detector, and I think when thinking about design of any survey, you try and make the reward for people taking part as big as possible. And the reward here was for the students to get back really quickly and tell them, this is what we think was recorded in your garden or on your land. So that was a kind of real eye-opener. So the next obvious step was, having done Norwich and showed that work, I was thinking, how can we scale it up a bit to a kind of larger area, say to the whole of Norfolk. And Norfolk is quite a fairly big county, 5,500 square kilometres. So again, we got some funding for detectors, and we didn't have enough master students to cover the whole county. So what I thought was, if I could set up places that could host a detector, so across the county, perhaps evenly spaced across the county, so anyone within Norfolk would be within, say, 5-10 minutes drive of a detector they could borrow. That would be a great way. They could borrow the equipment, we could get the data back, they could just put it in the post, we could analyze it. And that really took off. So we got amazing coverage in Norfolk. But a lot of that was really just in my evenings, thinking, how do we design this? At one point I borrowed loads of laptops. I had 7 laptops around me trying to process the data. We're getting SD cards, kind of the amount of data you can get from bat survey, static detectors. And I think maybe it's probably about 12 years ago, I kind of was really thinking, there aren't any methods that are very quick for processing bat data, and there aren't any that really perform very well. It all seemed a bit kind of random in terms of the results you get. So you're ending up looking at so many recordings to try and work out what bat species it was. So at that point, I started working on actually collaborating with people in France who are thinking about similar questions for the French National Bat Monitoring Programme, particularly a guy called Yves Barr, who based in Paris. And he gave me a lot of support in terms of getting feedback on identification on things. And but at the same time, I started working with him, building classifiers to identify different species of bat.
And in terms of that, so just going back a step then. So prior to then building these classifiers, then this was all done manually. So just scrolling through hours worth of recordings and just identifying manually which species that's assistant would look at, then putting it down, and then that, so just pure manual classification at this point.
Yeah, and definitely when I had Anabats, it was looking through everything, and but the whole time I realised if we're going to scale this up, we need ways of saving time on everything.
Yeah.
We need we kind of really need ways of processing data quickly. We need to get some good results to minimize the amount of time we're spending checking results, needing to check results. So I guess about 8 years ago, we had what is now the acoustic pipeline, but it was on our computer cluster. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't accessible to externally, but it got to a point where we could put folders somewhere, and then it would automatically take those folders into somewhere. It would pull out call measurements. It would apply the classifiers that I built. And at that point, it produced a PDF summary of what was recorded. So what we could then do is take that, email it to the person who's taken part in the survey. And with caveats that we'd be carrying out further checking of the automatic identification later in the season. So we were very careful to really highlight there could be, or very likely to be, errors in what we provide, that kind of initial results. But at the same time, I thought it's really important to get back to people quickly.
Yeah.
I think at that time, the normal thing was to wait until, say, the winter, when you had more time to look at the recordings.
Yeah.
But by that time, you've lost, particularly working with volunteers, you've lost their kind of interest and enthusiasm. But if you could get back to people within a couple of days with some first results, quite often, certainly some of those people would then go on and survey, take on a lot more. So yeah, I think everything I do, it's trying to save time, trying to find ways of coding things to make it simpler at every stage. And the pipeline is, which was released last year, is really a front to what we've developed over many years that allows other people to upload recordings.
Okay, before we get on to the acoustic pipeline itself, then, in terms of, I mean, you mentioned there a couple of things that's been interesting. So obviously the building of these autoclassifiers, and you mentioned also about coding as well. Is this something that is it that you've done yourself, or is it a collaboration with other coders, for instance?
So I think I really built on initial stuff that people in France, Yves Barr, they developed some initial code for kind of helping to run the national bat monitoring program in France. So I kind of then built on that, and I was really lucky at the BTO that I had I applied for a research fellowship that gave me 6 months to work on just stuff that interested me, which is quite rare. So there's a lot of competition internally to get this, but I was very lucky to get this. But it allowed me to work with people in France, to go out there. And initially we started working on actually the sound identification of bush crickets.
Okay, yes.
So I think everyone who puts out bat detectors, probably a lot of bat workers really hate bush crickets because they'll just fill up your memory cards. Yeah. But I think for me, I just saw it as an amazing opportunity. Bush crickets are quite poorly recorded in their own right. And if I could build them into the bat classifiers and identify them as bycatch, it's something free. Mm-hmm. And even for people who are not interested in bush crickets, being able to say which recordings perhaps just have bush crickets is really helpful. So rather than looking through, okay, it's a dark bush cricket, dark bush cricket, dark bush cricket. Oh, it's a bat. It kind of saves a huge amount of time in doing that.
Oh, I remember doing it was a bat survey. This is when I was living in Wales, South Wales, and so I lived in a place called Tongbyn Lice, and just off Tongbyn Lice, there's this huge roundabout called Corriton Roundabout, And on there, we used to go there. It was a sort of mini nature reserve, and went there across there, looking for bats. With great nocturnal displays because there's some great woodlands nearby, so that you could see some large displays of nocturals flying across. But we went across into Corriton Roundabout to listen for what bat species we got. And you're right, it was just all we could hear was, I think it was long-winged conehead. Crickets all the time across there. And, I didn't know where they were long-winged coneheads at the time, but it wasn't until we got back and played them. And I think it was, I forgot the chap's name, Greg. But he sort of introduced me to the world of bush cricket. So you're right, it's just those knock-on effects. So, you get into one species, but not, it also throws you onto another species as well. Yeah. So, so, I mean, it does bush crickets and moths as well, you said.
Yeah, so the bush crickets I think have been locally I found new populations of great green bush cricket, which is quite rare in Norfolk, but this is through bycatch, so people putting out bat detectors to record to find out about bats. But I've got a project on Guernsey where we found large conehead as a new species for Channel Isles. Yeah. We found it on 3 separate islands. Again, it's through a bat survey as bycatch. We found sickle-bearing bush cricket, another continental species, in an area slightly outside its known range in Sussex. So this is all through bat surveys, what we could pull out. And bush crickets were the obvious one, because you tend to get more bush crickets recorded than bats quite often. And as you mentioned, moths are the other one, which can produce, some moth species produce ultrasound. So I think at the moment, there's definitely a lot more species that I don't know produce ultrasound that I still need to work on. But there's one green silver lines, really distinctive calls. So I built those into the bat classifier. Another one, bird cherry ermine, where I saw the caterpillars, bred them up, very easy to get recordings. They're an amazing moth. They're completely deaf. They can't hear the sound they produce. But every time they fly, they produce it to deter bat predation.
Right.
So it's very easy to get recordings. You just see them fly. I'd bred them out in a flight kind of cage. And then I could take those recordings and build them into the classifier.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of unknowns there. There'll be a lot of species. And then that got me onto what else can you identify? And quite often I was seeing small mammal recordings in there as well. So that was the next group that I really got into.
So it includes like harvest mouse, dormouse, rats as well.
Yeah, I think initially I was feeding garden birds and I was keeping chickens as well, and we had a bit of a rat problem. And it was a real eye-opener going out with a bat detector. It was just deafening. Wherever you walked, you would just hear really loud rats. So that was a kind of real eye-opener. And at that time, I kind of realised that Neil Middleton was working on a book, or he's just starting to work on a book called "Is That a Bat?" For Pelagic Publishing. So I collected what I could feed into that. But after we'd finished that, we worked on a paper for British Wildlife on the sound identification of small mammals. Mm-hmm. That was trying to fill in a lot of the other gaps. But that was just really good fun. Working with, Neil Middleton, who's good fun to work with anyway, and Huma Pierce, so again, is brilliant, really good. And a lot of that was trying to record captive individuals where there were captive individuals. So going to places like the British Wildlife Centre and leaving static detectors to try and get recordings of things like hazel dormice and harvest mice. But also had a license to keep shrews for a short period of time for naturalling and to record shrews and other common species of small mammal. So I dedicated, I'm not sure my wife was terribly impressed, a whole room with terrariums where I'd be live catching individuals. I'd keep them overnight, get recordings, what I was trying to do is get as many recordings as I could
Yeah.
to understand the range of vocalizations, and um, and to then again build those into the bat classifiers. So when you put a bat detector out, if there happens to be, say, hazel dormice calling, and hazel dormice are really good, they've got really loud calls, they're really vocal, I could also identify those as bycatch.
Yeah.
So I think for small mammals, it's a really new field. Hardly anyone, there's no national acoustic monitoring of small mammals yet. But I think there's a real opportunity, particularly for dormice, because they're really vocal, loud calls, for shrews, which are, again, really loud vocal species, and I think for some of the other species as well.
No, I think it's as you say, for surveying for dormouse, for instance, is it's quite challenging at times. So living at small populations, but any additional survey tool, such as acoustic surveying seems, strangely now you say it, quite logical. Yeah, really. So and achievable now with the technology. And so in terms of, just moving on from sitting on your desktop and your folders there to actually scaling up this acoustic pipeline into a commercial entity, which it is now. Just give me a little bit about the timeline there, but also, we'll go obviously now into what it does and why we should be using it.
Okay, so the whole thinking about the pipeline was really kind of going back to some of the bat surveys I've run. Often it's quite easy to get funding to start a project, but then to get funding to continue it in the long term is a lot more difficult. Or certainly I found that there's a lot of interest at the beginning. And with the pipeline, there's no external funding at all, or internal funding from the BTO going into it. And what I needed was to set up something that would pay for itself. So I guess working at the BTO, we're quite different than, our kind of ambitions are a bit different than, say, a company where the main outcome is profit. What I needed was to be able to cover its costs, and that's the costs of processing in the cloud, which are quite expensive. Also to be able to provide some level of support and to continue to develop it. That's the other really important thing, that it needs to continue to improve and develop over time, and to extend the functionality of it so that it remains competitive. So that was the kind of the business model. Not being a business person myself, that's quite a different kind of area for me to be thinking about. And I guess it's also a bit of a risk for the BTO. We've run it for 1 year, and it more than paid for itself in that first year. Yeah. So that was the most crucial year, to get people to want to use it enough, to find it valuable, to be able to at least some people to be able to pay to use it. The other thing was, I'm really keen to try and make it as cheap as possible, where the data can benefit conservation. So I guess, again, working for an NGO like the BTO, and we may need to think about our costings in the future, but at the moment it's cheaper if people are happy to share the data with us. That was the kind of decision. Are people happy to share the data, even if they're a commercial company and able? Sometimes then obviously not able, the data needs to remain confidential. But if they're able to, then it's quite a lot cheaper for people to use it. So yeah, that was the kind of thinking.
And it's been up and running for just about a year now, you say?
Just over a year.
Yeah.
And I think during that time, it's processed, I think, about 60 terabytes of recordings. So there's been, I think, maybe 30 million bat identifications and similar number of bush crickets, maybe 100,000 small mammal kind of mammal identifications. And I think over that time, I've also had projects which have allowed me to work on, initially my focus was UK, but to work on kind of wider European bat sound identification. I've had one really big project in an area called Polesia, which, so we had 3 years of the project working in, fortunately it's come to an end, as you'll find out, in Ukraine and Belarus. So deploying bat detectors, so working with organisations on the ground to deploy bat detectors across a 100,000 square kilometre area. So this is massive data set. So it gave me an opportunity to work on things like greater nocturnal and pond bat and kind of a much wider suite of species, but also spend time working on, I've got a PhD student now working on sound identification of small mammals in Belarus and Ukraine. They've actually shifting their fieldwork outside those at the moment. So you might expect.
For perhaps
we've
obvious
got kind
reasons.
of a lot of data for that area, and also working on kind of bush crickets, which is really difficult. There's a couple of people in the world who can identify some species of bush cricket from their sounds. So I'm being really careful in when I kind of speak to these people that I don't annoy them or send them too many emails. And as a consequence of that project, which is part of a endangered landscape partnership, I've now got 6 other projects in other countries, from Portugal to the Danube Delta to the kind of Georgia, one in Cairngorms. So, and all this is about providing infrastructure to support bat surveys in these countries, to be able to provide, well, the pipeline for them to be able to upload recordings, to make it a lot easier for processing bat recordings like that.
Okay, so this is like in one way a two-way sort of business model. That obviously, if I'm a user, I can put my data onto the upload my data. I get back an analysis of the data that was provided, and equally so, if I agree to it, then that I'm also feeding into actually making this pipeline a lot more sensitive as well, and a better acoustic tool.
Yeah, definitely. So those recordings will then feed back. Obviously, you've got the data on what was identified where. You've got the recordings where we find errors. We can then build those back in to the classifier to then improve it. So there's quite a lot that we got planned. There's a long list of things that we're kind of working on with the pipeline. Some things are going to happen quite quickly. Other things that might take a year or two. But we're just at kind of one particular point in the development at the moment.
In terms of that learning exercise, then, in terms of improving the classifiers, then, so is that something that is done? I mean, excuse my ignorance on this, but in the learning, is that sort of fed in by yourself, so a manual exercise in terms of improving the classifiers, or is it actually a bit of AI in there, actually a bit of self-learning by the classifiers themselves?
So at the moment, it's quite manual. So what I've been doing is continually trying to collect recordings, particularly for some of the more cryptic species. So this last weekend I was out at a Brandt's bat roost, recording in the vicinity of that as to try and get additional recordings that I could then use to see what is the performance for identifying Brandt's bat. So continually collecting those for cryptic species. For other species which are more straightforward to identify, when there's kind of clear errors, I then label those, as you say, what they really were, build those in, build a new classifier, and then it just slowly, iteratively improves over time. Well, that's where we are now, but one of the things I'm really keen to develop is a verification portal, which is part of the pipeline. And several reasons for this. It'll allow for verification to be carried out within the pipeline. So we need to give this some thought. Who do we assign as experts? how do we make the data that can be shared accessible, more accessible? So it's trying to improve the quality of the data that we output. And in the long term, I'm really keen that that feeds into, say, local reporting and national reporting. Mm-hmm. At the moment, because you need that auditing, it's a really important part of the process. The data isn't feeding directly into, so we're not passing on a copy directly to the local record centre, because there will be errors, and we're really keen to build that kind of mechanism. But I think for environmental consultants, so over the past year, I've spoken to many companies about their approach to auditing, verifying species identification, and there's no kind of standardized way of doing it. Yeah. There's very different levels of kind of rigor, and so one thing I'm really keen to do is to try and provide tools. So one thing I've been working on with colleagues is it's just a simple R-Shiny app that will take the pipeline results and then look for the recordings that are named and say move them into species folders based on the identification. And that means you can, rather than searching for individual recordings, which is really time consuming, you can look through all the identifications which was assigned to, say, barber cell in one go. So you've got efficiencies in terms of time saving. It'll also allow you, this little shiny app, allow you to do things like, if you've got something like, say, common pipistrelle, where you might have, say, a couple of 100,000 recordings, it'll randomly select, say, 1,000 samples, 1,000 recordings, put them in a folder, and then you can check those to quantify the error of the identification.
Right.
So you could then use that to justify if there's like 2 errors out of 1,000. So rather than checking or scrolling through, I don't know how many, well, I know some people do this, scroll through the whole data set, it's really inefficient. But when you start thinking about it in terms of some of these time savers, so as I say, initially we're going to make an R-Shiny app where you don't need to know R at all. It'll be running a bit of code, and then it'll ask you questions about what you want. Do you want to take a random, is it a common species? Do you want to take a random sample? What's your sample? Mm-hmm. What probability? You might put things into 2 folders based on higher probability and lower probability for checking. You might want to check identifications where nothing was identified in it, a sample of those, but you don't want to check everything. You might want to check a random sample. So I think one thing I'm really keen to do is work with companies to develop, well, hopefully make the pipeline more useful, save more time, but also provide these tools that provide more, I guess, more robust and repeatable, standardized auditing that will save people a lot of time.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I know. I can fully understand the the need for this, because it's as you say, getting that robust data is going to be important. Not for obviously the consultants to ensure that they have that confidence that what they're providing is correct and unbiased as well, because I'm sure there's a lot of biases we feed into sort of our results, and it's taking that bias away or minimising the bias when we're actually providing results, and much better outcomes for conservation at the end of it.
Yeah, that's the aim anyway.
Yeah.
So I think.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I know.
No, I say. Well, I was just very interested. So let's run through the BTO Acoustic Pipeline. So you mentioned it was aimed at a commercial entity, so environmental or ecological consultancies, for instance, who've got large data and want to analyse that. So run us through. So how we what do we need to do in order to actually then provide you with the data?
Okay, so I guess it's worth explaining there's 2 parts to the pipeline. There's a desktop app which you where you register for a pipeline account first. You can then download this app which you put in your computer, and all that app does is manage the uploading of recordings to the cloud where they're processed. What this will do is, if you're using a bat detector that records location embeds it within, uses guano to embed it in the WAV file. It'll pull that automatically, and then it'll use that location to then decide what classifier do I push it through. So if someone, say, got a project in Tasmania, say, oh, I have got a project in Tasmania. If someone uploads it from Tasmania, it'll push it through a classifier that I built that considers the suite of species you've got in Tasmania. But kind of more local level, if someone uploads from Belgium, it'll consider that the broader suite of continental species you get there. If you upload from Scotland, it won't be considering Becksteins, and so it's a way of trying to get the best results kind of regionally. The pipeline also flag anything that's unexpected for that particular county. Mm-hmm. So if you upload a recording of Liza's bat, say, and there's very few records for the county, it'll flag that with a warning in the results that a kind of caution that you need to kind of check this very carefully. It could be the species, but it could be an error. So we're trying to make it as easy for people as possible to, hopefully provide some interpretation. So what people would generally do, use this desktop app, it'll upload recordings to the cloud, and then we have computers working in the cloud processing the data, and as soon as they're finished processing, you'll be emailed to say it's finished processing, and you can look in and download, at the moment, a CSV of the results that have been recorded. I think the other thing that's quite useful is if you've got a company where you've got lots of field workers collecting data for the same project, what you can do is those people can register for an account. We can set up a project where those individuals can upload to, it can be a private project if it's confidential, or it could be a shared project. Upload to that, and then you could assign project organizers who can see everything that's been uploaded to that project, and the results as the data is being processed. But I guess an added advantage of that is you can potentially store the recordings in the cloud and get them back in a standardized format. So I know myself, I'm quite careful to use a kind of set folder hierarchy, but if you have different field workers, they do different things, different naming conventions. So this gets the data it makes it a lot simpler when you come to look at the data. It gets rid of those problems. I'm trying to think what else, but it's also really helpful having projects if you've got a volunteer project. So I've got a project on Guernsey and some of the other islands where we've got a few hundred people uploading recordings remotely. So these are volunteers who they register for an account, then they can upload recordings directly to the project. Yeah. They get their results back within a few hours. All the recordings are stored in the cloud, and then when I've got more time, I can pull back all those recordings for auditing, carrying out further checking, and then feeding back any errors and kind of improving the classifiers.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great tool. I mean, I say I've had a quick look around the platform itself, or sort of the website itself, and I suppose in one things I suppose I'm going to look at really in terms of getting the best data out. In terms of obviously good data in, good data out. So in terms of tips, in terms of quality of recordings, for instance. So how do we get the best recordings to you?
Okay, that's a really important point, and I think having worked with quite a lot of consultancies this year and been sent recordings from a lot of consultancies, I think there's quite a few that perhaps don't think about the quality of the recordings they're getting. And I think one of the most important things you can do is doesn't depend on the detector you use. It's more about placement of the detector, and I think the ideal is to pole mount your microphone or detector if it's something like a Sonmeter mini bat. Say raise it up 9 foot, but importantly, don't try and hide it. I think don't try and hide it within vegetation or put it next to a wall or flat surfaces like that. if you do that, you'll get quite often horribly distorted recordings, and that will then influence the performance of the classifier, the pipeline, but it will also influence how far you're going to get with identification manually, particularly for, like, if you're thinking about the myotis, some of the more cryptic species, where if you start to get distortion, particularly at the start and the end of the calls, it's difficult enough, but you kind of, I don't know, it's one of the most crucial things, really.
Yeah.
I think the problem is kind of related around the security equipment, leaving it out and not making it really obvious. But I think there's things that can be done to just get that microphone away from any flat surfaces, away from vegetation. It only needs to be, say, 1.5 meters away, and you'll get considerably better recordings.
Because I certainly know that if we're dealing with potential roosts, for instance, we're often a surveyor maybe handheld holding on to the detector themselves, and it may even be. I mean, I'm sure there'd be a few. There may even be only a few meters away from like a solid surface there. So I imagine you're going to get some sort of distortion coming from the bat into the recording if you're that close.
I think there's two things there. One, holding a detector, and you're then a flat surface. So if you're using an ecometer touch, it looks completely mad. But if you could extend it on a lead, on a pole, on your back, higher than you, get it away from you, the quality of recordings you'll get will be much better. But there's another really important point to do with emergence, and what you'll find if you record directly at emergence. And I've spoken to a lot of people who've been doing this. So they put the detector right at the point where the bat comes out. Mm-hmm. What you'll get is very atypical calls, very elevated calls that are not very typical of a free-flying bat. If you can move your detector away, say 8 meters away from the emergence itself, you'll start to get much more typical calls of free-flying bats. Yeah. That'll be easier for you to identify when you come to manually look at them, but also it'll be easier for the pipeline to identify. Because you look at things like nocturnal, they can produce really short duration, extreme calls that don't really look like nocturnal if you're recording at the point they're coming out.
I also remember, again, my days back in Wales. That's down in Cardiff Bay. We had. I was pretty lucky that we had, the 3 species of pipistrelle down there at certain times of the year, and remember doing some emergence surveys of. We knew them were enthusiasts in these roosts, and yet when we heard them coming out, they were almost like sopranos.
Yeah.
Because we were so close to. I imagine now, so close to the roost that the frequencies were elevated.
Yeah, I think if you're recording at emergence, you're really increasing the challenge of identification. You're making your job a lot harder.
Yeah.
And
it was just as we just went, you can see that pattern go. It started to feel like almost like 52, 53 kilohertz, and then all the way down to like 38. As it travelled away from the roost itself, or there was a second detector surveyor a bit further away. Yeah. Interesting. So, good quality data in terms of the obviously 1.5 meters above ground or something like this, and not on protected vertical surfaces, horizontal surfaces. Call duration then. So sorry, recording. So I mean, I see on your website it mentions about a certain length of call that you analyse. Yeah.
I think that's really related to what's optimum for the classifiers that I work on, and because I think a lot of kind of other options out there will tell you what the dominant species is. So if you have a common pit recording that has a weak barber cell, it won't identify the barber cell. What the pipeline tries to do is identify the multiple species in there. But the longer the recording you get, the more challenging it becomes to identify multiple species, because potentially you have more species the longer it gets. And we've generally found if you could produce recordings of about 5 seconds, that's the optimum performance. So what we've done is, I think the ideal is for people to set their bat detector to define the maximum length to be 5 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of ideal. I think the other advantage is it means that your recordings are much more standardized. If you're interested in bat activity, comparing lots of 5-second recordings rather than some that might be, I don't know, 25, 30 seconds, whole kind of range. If you don't define that maximum, you get such a range of lengths, which means that if you're interested in bat activity, quantifying that, it just adds more noise to it. So I think there's added advantages of using 5 seconds. But if people upload long recordings, what the pipeline does, it automatically splits the recording to be 5 seconds anyway. So it does complicate auditing a bit more, because then you get an identification for the section.
We just standardise the way we record, the bats that are using gadget. So
I think a lot of other options also have an optimum of 5 seconds, even if they process longer recordings. It does become increasingly more difficult.
And in terms of, we mentioned about the recordings themselves. Now, what format do you take the recordings in?
Okay, so they're WAV files. So it needs to be recorded on a full spectrum detector. They need to be WAV files. We won't be able to process like zero crossing recordings or frequency division. And then it needs to be single channel, so not multi-channel. I don't think that many people use multi-channel now. I think in the past they did. And lastly, it will process time expansion recordings, but they need to be converted to real time first. So you'll get an error message saying they need to be converted.
So it gives you a user error then, before you.
But I think also if you're using a detector where it has an inbuilt GPS, I think it's really useful to use that to embed the location within the WAV file, because the pipeline will pull that automatically. And if you don't use the GPS, then you'll have to add it in manually. You'll have to define what that is.
Okay, and in terms of the choice of detector, I mean, are we limited to a certain detector, or is it a wide range of detectors you can actually use then?
I think any full spectrum detector. I think amongst those there are some that are kind of not my favourites. So I think, I don't know if this is fair to say, I think there's more challenges with the audio moth recordings. Particularly I don't feel the microphone performs so well at higher frequency. So it's fine for nocturnal pipistrelles, where it doesn't matter if you lose the start of the call. But for myotis, I think it becomes a lot more critical. But again, if you pole mount an audio moth, you can get the most out of it. If you hide it if you put it in a plastic bag, as you quite often see on their website, that's one of the worst things you can do, and hide it in vegetation.
Yeah.
That's a bad idea. I think also with the batlogger recordings, batloggers, I think with the more recent ones, you can change the gain. But before that, I think it's with the A plus and some of the older ones, you can't adjust gains. You quite often get very overloaded clip recordings where it's very difficult to pull good measurements from just overloaded. The bats come too close. If I saw that on a song meter detector, I'd change the gain, but you don't have the option to do that with some of the batloggers, the older ones.
Yeah. Okay. So interesting then. So obviously it's knowing your bat detector, knowing the limitations of it, and it may influence your future purchasing decisions. But at the moment, audio, batlogger, Pearsonic, Peterson, Tiddley, Wildlife Acoustics, all those detectors. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And how would someone find out about the optimum settings then for these ones? And is it something that you put together, or is it something that really as the user they should be able to find out themselves?
So we've put together a manual which people can download on the website, which anything that's a bit unusual, so it may anything where like the default settings are not very good for identification, we've kind of made a note of that. So as an example, the Titley chorus, they're built in, I think it's a kind of high pass filter. They scrub everything below about 10 kilohertz. So that's really good for bat identification. You get really clean looking recordings. But if you're interested in small mammals, as we are with a pipeline, with bird sounds, it scrubs the lower part but leaves the upper harmonics start to look on their own like small mammals. So you get, if you use the default setting, you'll get more misidentifications of small mammals. So we've kind of made a note of anything that's a bit unusual like that.
Right. Okay. I'm sorry, but in terms of, I mean, you've been very generous with your time. In terms of, okay, the sort of duration. So we upload, we've done recordings, we upload them onto the acoustic pipeline. So what's the sort of turnaround time then? So in terms of, analysis then?
So I'd say it's normally within an hour. It can take longer. So the time it takes to return it will depend on the volume of other people who've uploaded, because it'll be in a queue. So at the moment, we say, well, we guarantee within a couple of days, but normally it's within, well, it can be very quick if there's not much being uploaded at that particular time, or it could be an hour. But you can set up multiple uploads. So if you've got many folders, you could set each set up to upload and queue one at a time, and then just leave it. So it'll upload and then process and return the results.
I think it's let's put it this way, that's a lot quicker than actually the manual identification process that we're used to in a few years ago.
Yeah. And I think really that's not, well, it's not very efficient.
No, not at all. No.
I
think there's a lot of things that are missed and maybe not recorded correctly either. So and in terms of finding out about the acoustic pipeline, so where can people go to actually find out a bit more about this the program itself?
So I think probably the easiest thing to do is if you do a search for BTO Acoustic Pipeline in Google or any web search, you'll find it quite easily. But I think the other thing to say there, for every person that registers, you're able to upload 100 gigabyte for free to test out. So I think it's really worth anyone just trying it out and comparing the results with what kind of their approach at the moment, to see if it'll save them time. So I think that's probably, if you do a search for BTO Acoustic Pipeline, it's quite easy to find, and then you register for an account, and you can then download the app, which will allow you to upload recordings.
Great. Well, I'll also put in a link to the website as well. So so within the show notes themselves. So that's fantastic. In terms of, I mean, you mentioned a lot about what you're working on at the moment, and future projects. So it seems to me you're not exactly you're twiddling your thumbs where you are at the moment. There's a lot going on. So what's the next part of your journey then? So Stuart, then.
I think there's quite a few things I'd like to do this year. So I'm working on a book with Neil Middleton and Huma Pearce at the moment on the sound identification of terrestrial mammals in Britain and Ireland. So this will cover everything from like big stuff, from deer down to kind of pygmy shrews. And I'm really keen. I think we're about chapter 5 in at the moment, so we've made a good start. But I'm really hoping, well, it'd be really nice to try and get a big bulk of that written by the end of the year. So that's one thing. I think other things, we're extending the pipeline to add some other species groups. So I work with a colleague of mine, Simon Gillings, who's been working on bird sound identification for quite a long time. So one of the things we'll be extending the pipeline to also identify nocturnal birds. So I think in the first instance, it'll be European owls and nightjar and woodcock and things like that. And I guess the last thing I'd like to try and crack this year is, so at the moment, the pipeline, if it finds social calls, it'll assign those to hopefully the right species. So if there's Liza's bat social calls, but at the moment, the results don't say it's a social call. It'll just assign it to Liza's bat. Or what I'm really keen to do is to split that up, so it'll also return an identification for those. I don't know whether that's just me being interested in social calls.
Yeah.
I don't know what the kind of interest is or how useful it'd be. I kind of hope with Neil Middleton's work on this and his new book, it'll kind of get people more interested. But yeah, that's more something I'd quite like to do.
So that's enough to keep you busy then for a few months. Yeah.
Should be.
All right.
Yeah.
And this one final question we ask to all the people on the podcast themselves is, you've had a wonderful career so far, and in terms of maybe looking back at that early part of your career, sort of advice you'd either give yourself or maybe a new ecologist coming through about the routes open to them as an ecologist. What sort of a career tips would you give or advice could you give to those people?
I guess there's a couple of things. One I've always tried to do, and it's kind of worked out okay in the end. Sometimes I've had kind of periods where there hasn't been a kind of clear transition or I haven't had a clear idea of where my career path is going. But I've tended to make decisions based on what I think I'll enjoy the most. As long as I've got enough money to kind of live on and not starve, that's my kind of criteria. And I'm really pleased I've done that. It's kind of led me to work with some really, really amazing people, really great people, to work on things that really interest me. And I wouldn't change that. I think that's a really good, if you can do that, if you can work on things and make decisions on what would I like to spend my time doing. Because so when you have a job, it's a big part of your life. It's a big part of your time. And if you can enjoy what you're doing, it makes such a big difference.
Oh, no, I totally agree. There's this fantastic book by Marcus Buckingham called Love and Work, and he mentions something very, very similar to what you're mentioning there about he calls them red threads. So if you can find a red thread that you can do every day, something you love doing every day, and that's the most important part, every day. It could be for a minute, it could be 5 minutes, it could be for hours. But finding something you love every day, I think you will have a life fulfilled. So I think that's great advice, Stuart.
I think the other thing is if you get to a point where you're starting to lose interest. I know myself. I've been working on birds for a long time, and I was working on a lot of the same things every year. So producing trends, producing like government indicators for birds, and if you get to the point where it's feeling a bit stale or it's not really what you want to be doing, then that's a point to start thinking, what would I like to be doing? And then working back from there, how can I change my job, change my career to try and either get the skills that you need to do that, or get a bit of funding to try and start doing something. And that kind of first bit is really, I think, hard work, particularly if it's a slightly different field. So for me, bats it's not completely different than birds, but it's quite a different area. Yeah, it just takes a bit of time.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I say it's just that thing you love doing. So whether it be problem solving, so it doesn't matter whether it be birds, bats, butterflies, and so forth. It's still that problem solving, and open yourselves up to those interesting career conversations. So whether it be hopefully with your the same employer, so you don't need to jump ship between different companies. There is that lateral transition you could do, but wonderful. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you've been, as you say, so generous with your time, and thank you for putting up with that. By the looks of it, we're on one of the hottest days of the year, and you're in a bit of a sweat box up there in your attic as well.
I'm in it's like an attic. There's a tiny window, and yeah, it's quite sweltering. But
I see. Well, you're glowing, Stuart. There we go. So, but well, thank you so much. So, Stuart Newson, thank you for joining me on the Ecology Academy podcast.
It's a pleasure. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
If you enjoy our show and want to help, then please click on the subscribe button and rate us on your favourite podcast player, as that's how you can inspire ecologists in the making, help retain great talent, and provide insights of our industry to a much wider audience of why ecology really does matter. Thank you. And remember, learning is a lifelong endeavour, so stay curious, be adventurous, and build bridges for others to cross.